I watched in horror as the massive oak tree crashed through Sheriff Corinne's roof like a missile from heaven. Glass exploded everywhere. Her bedroom window shattered into 1,000 pieces. The woman who had illegally destroyed my family's heritage tree just hours before now stood in her driveway, screaming at the sky as decades of karma buried her living room under 2 tons of ancient wood. But this was not the end of her punishment. This was only the beginning of the justice she had coming. For 80 years, the oak tree stood on the edge of my property like a guardian angel. My grandfather planted it the year he bought this land back in 1943. He was barely 25 then, fresh from the war, looking to build something beautiful and lasting for his family. That tree grew alongside 3 generations of my bloodline. It watched my father take his first steps. It shaded my wedding reception. It held the tire swing where my own children learned to fly. Every morning, I sat on my porch with coffee, watching the sunrise filter through those ancient branches. The tree was more than wood and leaves. It was family history carved into the earth. Its roots ran deep into soil that held the footsteps of everyone I had ever loved. My neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. We all knew each other's names. We borrowed tools and shared vegetables from our gardens. Crime was almost non-existent. When Sheriff Corinne first started patrolling our streets 2 years ago, she seemed professional and friendly. She waved when she drove by. She stopped to chat about the weather or ask about my roses. The tree had never been a problem for anyone. Its massive canopy provided shade for both my property and the edge of Corinne's yard next door. In summer, the branches offered relief from the brutal heat. In autumn, the falling leaves painted the ground in gold and crimson. Children from the whole neighborhood climbed its sturdy trunk and built forts in its branches. But I started noticing something strange about 6 months ago. Corinne would stand at her kitchen window, staring at my tree for long periods. She would walk the property line with measuring tape, making marks on her fence posts. When I waved to her during these inspections, she would not wave back. Her expression had changed from neighborly warmth to something cold and calculating. She began taking photographs of the tree from different angles. I assumed she was documenting storm damage or planning landscaping projects. I had no idea she was building a case against me. I had no idea that badge on her chest had poisoned her heart with power and turned my peaceful neighbor into an enemy who would stop at nothing to destroy what I treasured most. The tree that had stood for 8 decades, surviving storms and droughts and the changing seasons of life, was about to face its greatest threat, not from nature or disease or the passage of time, but from a woman who had forgotten that her badge was meant to protect and serve, not intimidate and destroy. The first confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was watering my flower beds when Sheriff Corinne appeared at my fence line, uniform crisp and badge gleaming in the sunlight. "We need to talk about your tree," she said, pointing up at the oak's sprawling branches. I set down my watering can and walked over with a smile. "What about it? Is everything okay?" "Those branches are hanging over the property line," she declared, pulling out a small notebook. "They are creating a public safety hazard. You need to have them trimmed immediately." I looked up at the tree, confused. The branches had grown the same way for decades. Nothing had changed. "Corinne, that tree has been there since before either of us was born. It has never been a problem for anyone." Her expression hardened. "Things change. I am the sheriff now, and I am telling you this is a code violation. You have 30 days to address it, or I will have to take official action." The conversation felt surreal. This was the same woman who had borrowed my ladder just last month. Now she was threatening me with legal action over a tree that had never hurt anyone. "Can you show me exactly which branches you are talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice reasonable. She pointed to several thick limbs that extended toward her property. All of those, they need to be cut back to the property line. Karen, cutting those branches would destroy the tree's natural shape. It would take years to recover, if it recovers at all. That is not my problem, she replied, closing her notebook with a sharp snap. 30 days. Over the following weeks, her demands escalated. She claimed the tree dropped too many leaves on her driveway. She said the roots were probably damaging her foundation, though she had no evidence. She invented new violations every time we spoke. The branches could fall during a storm, she argued during our third confrontation. Someone could get hurt. As sheriff, I cannot allow this liability to continue. Karen, that tree weathered the tornado of 1987 and the ice storm of 2009. It is healthier than most trees half its age. I do not care about its history, she snapped, her hand resting on her duty belt. I care about current safety standards and legal compliance. The way she said legal compliance made my stomach turn. She was using her badge as a weapon, throwing around official language to intimidate me into submission. This was not about safety or property lines or code violations. This was about power and control. You have 2 weeks left, she said, turning to leave. Do not make me take this to the next level. I watched her walk away, her uniform boots clicking against the pavement with military precision. The woman who had once been my neighbor was gone. In her place stood someone drunk on authority, someone who saw my cherished tree not as a living piece of history, but as a problem to be eliminated. That night, I called the city planning office to research property boundaries and tree regulations. What I discovered made my blood boil. The tree was entirely on my property. Every single branch she wanted removed was growing from my land, over my soil, shaded by my rights as a property owner. Karen had no legal authority to demand anything. She was abusing her badge to wage a personal war against a tree that had committed no crime, except growing too close to a small woman with too much power. The ultimatum came on a Friday afternoon. Karen appeared at my door in full uniform, official documents in hand, and 2 deputies flanking her like bodyguards. This is your final notice, she announced, handing me a paper with an official seal. Emergency Safety Order 2020-4017. Your tree poses an immediate threat to public safety and must be removed within 48 hours. I stared at the document in disbelief. Removed? Karen, you said trimmed. Now you want the entire tree cut down. The situation has escalated, she replied coldly. Our arborist determined that partial removal would destabilize the remaining structure. Complete removal is the only safe option. What arborist? When did anyone inspect my tree? That information is in the file. You have 48 hours to comply, or we will take action to ensure public safety. I spent the weekend frantically researching. I called every city office, every county department, every agency that might have jurisdiction over tree removal. What I discovered was devastating. There was no emergency safety order. There was no arborist report. There was no legal authority for what Karen was demanding. She had fabricated the entire thing. Monday morning, I called in sick to work. I positioned myself at my front window, watching for any sign of trouble. At 10:30 a.m., a city truck pulled up to my curb. 2 men in hard hats began unloading chainsaws and equipment. I ran outside, still in my pajamas and slippers. Stop, you cannot cut down that tree. Sorry, sir, one of the workers replied, checking his clipboard. We have a work order, emergency removal, sheriff's orders. That tree is on my property. I never gave permission for this. The worker looked uncomfortable. We just do what the paperwork says, sir. You need to take this up with whoever issued the order. I called Corinne's office frantically. Her secretary said she was unavailable. I called the mayor's office. He was in meetings all day. I called every lawyer in the phone book, but it was too late. By noon, the chainsaws were screaming. I stood in my yard like a man watching his house burn down, helpless and heartbroken as 80 years of family history fell in sections to the ground. Each cut felt like a knife in my chest. The workers moved efficiently, professionally, completely unaware they were destroying something irreplaceable. The trunk was massive, nearly 4 feet across. It took them 3 hours to bring down what had taken 8 decades to grow. When the final section crashed to the earth, the sound echoed through the neighborhood like thunder. I gathered pieces of bark and small branches, tears streaming down my face. These fragments were all that remained of my grandfather's legacy, my children's playground, my family's guardian angel. As the workers loaded their trucks and prepared to leave, Sheriff Corinne appeared at her back door. She stood there watching me grieve, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on her face. "Should have trimmed it when I asked," she called out across the yard. "Now you have nothing." But Corinne had made one critical mistake in her rush to destroy what I loved. She had forgotten the most basic law of physics. What goes up must come down. And a tree that massive, cut without proper planning or consideration for wind direction, was going to fall wherever gravity and nature decided. She was about to learn that sometimes the universe has a sense of justice all its own. The oak tree fell at 3:47 p.m. on a Monday afternoon. I will remember that moment for the rest of my life. The workers had calculated the fall direction based on the tree's natural lean, but they had not accounted for the afternoon wind that picked up just as they made the final cut. They had not considered that 8 decades of growth had created an uneven weight distribution in the massive canopy. Most importantly, they had not consulted with me about the tree's quirks and characteristics, because Corinne had convinced them this was an emergency removal that required no input from the property owner. As the ancient oak began its death fall, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The trunk creaked and groaned like a dying giant. Birds exploded from the branches in a panic of wings and desperate cries. The tree twisted as it fell, its massive weight carrying it away from its intended path. Instead of falling toward the empty lot where the workers had planned, the oak pivoted on its stump and crashed directly through the roof of Sheriff Corinne's house. The sound was apocalyptic. Glass shattered like gunshots. Wood splintered and screamed. The impact shook the ground beneath my feet and set off car alarms throughout the neighborhood. 2 tons of ancient wood and branches punched through Corinne's roof like it was made of paper, crushing her bedroom, destroying her living room, and filling her hallway with debris. I stood frozen in my yard, watching splinters of her window frames sparkle in the afternoon sunlight like falling snow. Part of me wanted to run and check if she was hurt, but a deeper part of me, the part that had watched my family's heritage get murdered by a woman drunk on power, felt a dark satisfaction that I will not apologize for. Corinne came running out of her front door, screaming at the sky like she could argue with gravity itself. my house," she shrieked, turning in circles as she surveyed the devastation. "This is your fault. You did this on purpose." The city workers stood in stunned silence, chainsaws still running, looking back and forth between the destroyed house and their clipboards like they could find an explanation in the paperwork. "Ma'am," one of them finally said, shutting off his saw, "we followed the work order exactly. This was not supposed to happen." "You idiots, you incompetent morons," Karen screamed, her face red with rage and disbelief. "Do you know how much this is going to cost me?" I walked closer to survey the damage, careful to stay on my own property. The tree had punched a hole through her roof that looked like a meteor strike. Branches filled what used to be her master bedroom. Her expensive patio furniture was crushed beneath the canopy. Her garden was buried under leaves and debris. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted by the universe itself. Corinne had illegally destroyed my tree to protect her property, and the tree had responded by destroying her property instead. "This is going to be thousands of dollars in damage," she moaned, pulling out her phone to call her insurance company. "My roof, my windows, my furniture, everything is ruined." I listened to her make that phone call with growing amusement. She was about to learn something very important about insurance policies and illegal activities. "What do you mean, not covered?" she shouted into her phone. "A tree fell on my house. That is exactly what homeowners insurance is for." But her insurance company was asking the right questions. Why was the tree cut down? Who authorized the removal? Was it done legally and professionally? As Corinne tried to explain that she had ordered the emergency removal of a tree on someone else's property without their permission, I could hear her voice getting higher and more desperate. The universe had delivered swift and perfect justice. The woman who had used her badge to destroy my family's heritage was now standing in the wreckage of her own home, learning that actions have consequences and karma keeps perfect records. But this was only the beginning of what Corinne had coming. The tree falling on her house was nature's response to her abuse. My response was going to be much more thorough and legally devastating. The morning after the tree destroyed Corinne's house, I began documenting everything. I photographed the damage from every angle. I gathered the fake work orders and forged safety reports she had used to justify the illegal cutting. I saved voicemails, text messages, and every piece of evidence that proved she had abused her authority. But as I organized the files, I realized this was bigger than just my tree. Corinne's behavior followed a pattern of intimidation and power abuse that extended far beyond my property line. I started making phone calls to other residents in our neighborhood. What I discovered made my blood boil. Margaret Thompson, an elderly widow on Pine Street, told me Corinne had threatened to arrest her for obstruction of justice when she questioned a traffic ticket that was clearly written in error. "She said I was interfering with police business," Margaret whispered, afraid even now to speak too loudly. "I was just asking why she gave me a speeding ticket when I was parked in my own driveway." David Martinez shared a story about Corinne searching his teenager's car without permission during a routine traffic stop, claiming she smelled marijuana when there was none. "She tore apart my son's car looking for drugs that did not exist," David said, his voice shaking with anger. "When she found nothing, she gave him 3 citations for equipment violations instead. Broken tail light, expired air freshener, cracked windshield. None of it was true." One by one, the stories poured out. Corinne had been terrorizing our community for months, using her badge like a club to beat down anyone who questioned her authority or inconvenienced her personal agenda. I contacted attorney Sarah Chen, a civil rights lawyer in the state capitol who specialized in police misconduct cases. When I laid out the evidence, her response was immediate and decisive. "This is a clear pattern of civil rights violations," she said, reviewing the documentation. "The tree incident alone is destruction of property under color of law, which is a federal crime. But combined with these other incidents, we have grounds for a comprehensive lawsuit that could change how law enforcement operates in your county." Sarah explained that Corinne's abuse was not just illegal, it was unconstitutional. Using her position as sheriff to intimidate citizens, fabricate legal documents, and destroy private property violated the most basic principles of American justice. "We are going to file in federal court," Sarah announced. "Civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional rights, destruction of property, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. This woman is going to face consequences that will follow her for the rest of her career." Over the following weeks, other victims began reaching out. A local business owner who had been harassed over permit violations that did not exist. A young mother who had been threatened with child endangerment charges for letting her kids play in their own front yard. A veteran who had been subjected to illegal searches during traffic stops that seemed designed to humiliate him. Each story added weight to our case. Corinne had not just destroyed my tree, she had been systematically destroying the constitutional rights of every citizen in her jurisdiction. As I compiled witness statements and evidence, I felt a sense of purpose I had not experienced in years. This was no longer about revenge for a fallen tree. This was about holding power accountable and ensuring that no other family would suffer what mine had endured. Corinne had made the mistake of picking a fight with someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by seeking justice. She was about to discover that destroying something precious to someone is the fastest way to create an enemy who will never stop fighting. 3 weeks after the tree incident, I walked into the federal courthouse downtown with attorney Sarah Chen and a box of evidence that would end Sheriff Corinne's career forever. "Thompson versus Corinne Williams, Sheriff of Millfield County," Sarah announced to the filing clerk. "Civil rights violations under Section 1983, destruction of property, conspiracy, and abuse of process." The lawsuit was 47 pages of detailed documentation, proving that Corinne had used her badge to wage a personal war against the constitutional rights of citizens in her jurisdiction. The tree was just the most dramatic example of a pattern of behavior that had been terrorizing our community for months. Within hours of the filing, local media picked up the story. "Sheriff destroys heritage tree, gets house crushed by karma," was the headline that went viral across social media. The irony was too perfect for people to ignore. By evening, my phone was ringing constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Other victims wanted to join the lawsuit. Civil rights organizations offered support and resources. Corinne's response was predictably desperate and entirely wrong. The first intimidation attempt came at 6 a.m. the next morning. She appeared at my door in full uniform, 2 deputies behind her, attempting to look official and threatening. "You need to drop this lawsuit," she demanded. "Filing false accusations against a law enforcement officer is a serious crime. I could arrest you right now for harassment and defamation." I smiled and held up my phone, which was recording every word. "Please continue, Sheriff. My attorney will find this very interesting." Her face flushed red as she realized her mistake. Everything she said was being documented, and every threat she made only strengthened our case against her. "You think you are smart," she hissed, "but I am the law in this county. I can make your life very difficult." "You already tried that," I replied calmly. "How did that work out for your roof?" The second mistake came when Corinne called my employer, trying to get me fired by claiming I was under investigation for criminal activity. My boss recorded the call and forwarded it to Sarah Chen immediately. "Witness intimidation," Sarah explained with satisfaction. "Another federal crime. She is digging her own grave deeper with every desperate move. The media attention intensified when the video footage of the tree destruction began circulating online. Someone had been recording from their window when the oak fell, and the footage showed clearly that the workers had not followed proper safety procedures, and that Karen had been standing on her porch watching my family heritage get destroyed with obvious satisfaction. The comments section on every news article was brutal. People were outraged by the abuse of power, disgusted by the destruction of an 80-year-old tree, and amazed by the poetic justice of karma crushing her house. Sheriff Karen thought she could destroy what mattered to someone else and face no consequences, one comment read. The universe had other plans. Local politicians began distancing themselves from Karen as public opinion turned decisively against her. The county commissioners called for an independent investigation. The state attorney general announced a review of law enforcement practices in our county. Most damaging of all, the federal investigation began uncovering evidence of financial irregularities in the sheriff's department. Missing equipment, questionable overtime claims, and vendor contracts that seemed designed to benefit Karen's personal interests. What had started as a lawsuit over a destroyed tree was now exposing a web of corruption that reached deep into county government. Karen's final desperate move was attempting to negotiate a settlement. She offered to pay for a replacement tree and repair any property damage if I would drop the lawsuit. Absolutely not, I told Sarah during our meeting. This is not about money or trees anymore. This is about justice and accountability. She needs to face the full consequences of her actions, so this never happens to anyone else. The legal trap was closing around Karen with mathematical precision. Every move she made to escape only pulled the net tighter. The tree that she had illegally destroyed was about to become the root of her complete and total downfall. The reckoning arrived like a spring storm, sudden and overwhelming. The federal investigation concluded that Karen had violated the civil rights of at least 15 citizens over the course of 18 months. The pattern was clear and undeniable. She had used her badge to intimidate, harass, and punish anyone who inconvenienced her or questioned her authority. Criminal charges were filed on a Tuesday morning: conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights, destruction of property under color of law, wire fraud for filing false reports, official misconduct. The indictment read like a catalog of everything wrong with unchecked power. The recall election was scheduled for the following month, but Karen would not be sheriff long enough to face the voters. The county commissioners suspended her with pay pending the criminal trial, then terminated her employment when the evidence became public. Her insurance company denied coverage for the tree damage to her house, citing illegal activity as the cause of the loss. The massive oak trunk still sat in her crushed living room, a daily reminder of the consequences of her actions. Local contractors refused to work on her repairs after the story went viral. No one wanted to be associated with the corrupt sheriff who had terrorized her own community. The civil lawsuit proceeded even as the criminal case moved forward. Sarah Chen was methodical and relentless, presenting evidence that painted a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even experienced federal judges. The defendant used her position of trust and authority to wage personal vendettas against citizens whose only crime was inconveniencing her, Sarah argued in court. This is exactly the type of behavior that civil rights laws were designed to prevent. The community response was swift and decisive. A recall petition gathered signatures in record time. Local businesses that had supported Karen withdrew their endorsements. The police union issued a statement condemning her actions and emphasizing that her behavior did not represent the values of legitimate law enforcement. Corinne's few remaining allies abandoned her as the evidence mounted. Deputy sheriffs who had followed her orders began cooperating with investigators, revealing additional instances of misconduct that had not yet come to light. The financial consequences were devastating. Legal fees for both criminal and civil cases drained her savings. The damaged house lost most of its value, and she could not afford the repairs needed to make it livable. Most painfully for someone who had built her identity around wielding power over others, Corinne became powerless. She could not intimidate witnesses when federal marshals were protecting them. She could not fabricate evidence when everything was being recorded and scrutinized. She could not use her badge to escape consequences when that badge had been taken away. The woman who had destroyed my family's heritage tree, because she could not tolerate something beautiful that she did not control, was now facing the complete destruction of everything she had built her life around. But the reckoning extended beyond Corinne herself. The entire county government was forced to implement new accountability measures, citizen oversight committees, and transparent complaint processes. The tree that had stood for 80 years and died in a single afternoon had become the seed of systematic change that would protect future generations from the abuse of power. Justice was not just being served, it was being institutionalized to prevent another Corinne from ever terrorizing our community again. The new oak sapling was barely 3 feet tall, but it stood in the exact spot where its predecessor had grown for 8 decades. The entire neighborhood gathered for the planting ceremony on a perfect spring morning, 6 months after Corinne's conviction and sentencing. I knelt beside the young tree, my hands gentle on its slender trunk, feeling the smooth bark that would one day become deeply grooved and weathered like the grandfather oak that had fallen. This tree would grow in soil enriched by the decomposed remains of its ancestor, nourished by the same roots that had fed my family's heritage for generations. This is not just about replacing what was lost, I said to the crowd of neighbors, friends, and reporters who had gathered to witness this moment of renewal. This is about planting hope that grows stronger than the forces that try to destroy it. The legal settlement had been substantial. Corinne was ordered to pay damages not just to me, but to every citizen whose rights she had violated. The money would fund community improvements, legal aid for future victims of police misconduct, and a scholarship program for local students studying criminal justice and civil rights law. But the real victory was not measured in dollars. It was measured in the transformation of our community from a place where people lived in fear of badge abuse to a place where accountability and transparency were built into the system. Sheriff Rebecca Martinez, Corinne's replacement, had campaigned on a platform of community policing and constitutional accountability. Her first act in office was establishing a citizen review board with real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. "What happened to your tree and your neighbors should never happen again," Sheriff Martinez said during the ceremony. "Law enforcement exists to protect and serve, not to intimidate and destroy. This tree will remind us all of that responsibility." The children who played in the shade of the new oak would grow up in a different world than the one Corinne had tried to create. They would understand that power comes with limits, that badges come with accountability, and that ordinary citizens have both the right and the responsibility to stand up against injustice. Corinne herself had been sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and permanently banned from holding any law enforcement position. Her house, still bearing scars from the oak tree's final act of defiance, sat empty with a "for sale" sign that had grown weathered and faded over the months. She had left town immediately after her sentencing, unable to face the community she had betrayed. The woman who had once driven through our neighborhoods like a conquering general had slipped away in defeat and disgrace, leaving behind only the wreckage of her own making. As I watered the new sapling with the same watering can I had been holding the day Corinne first threatened my tree, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. A single act of abuse had exposed an entire system of corruption. One destroyed tree had planted the seeds of justice that would protect countless future victims. The oak that my grandfather planted in 1943 had lived to serve its ultimate purpose. It had not just provided shade and beauty, and a place for children to play. In its death, it had become a symbol of resistance against tyranny and a foundation for building something better. The neighborhood children approached the new tree with wonder, asking if they could help water it and when it would be big enough to climb. I promised them that this oak would grow tall and strong, just like its predecessor, and that their own children would one day play in its branches. "Will it really grow as big as the old tree?" a little girl asked, touching the sapling's tiny leaves with careful fingers. "Even bigger," I told her, looking around at the community that had come together to demand justice and plant hope. "This one is growing in soil that has been enriched by the sacrifice of what came before. It will be stronger than ever." The spring breeze rustled through the young leaves, and I could almost hear the whisper of my grandfather's voice, reminding me that the best trees are the ones that grow in the light of justice, watered by the tears of those who refuse to let tyrants win.